In the heart of rural Montana, where the wind carries secrets across endless prairies and the horizon stretches like an unfinished promise, there lived a woman who refused to surrender. At 96 years old, when most people would be content watching the world from their rocking chairs, Eleanor Ellie Mae Richardson was about to face the fight of her lifetime. Armed with nothing but her grandfather's shotgun, a heart full of determination, and a fierce love for her last remaining cow, she would stand against impossible odds that would terrify men half her age. This is not a fairy tale. This is not Hollywood fiction. This is the true story of one night that would transform an elderly rancher into a legend, proving that courage has no expiration date and that sometimes the smallest flame can illuminate the darkest hour. What happened on that moonless October night would challenge everything you think you know about human strength, animal instinct, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and the land she calls home. Eleanor Mae Richardson had lived through 16 presidents, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and countless Montana winters that could freeze a man's soul solid. At 96, her hands were weathered like ancient leather, marked by decades of ranch work, but they still held steady when wrapped around the handle of a coffee cup or the reins of a horse. Her steel-gray eyes had witnessed more sunrises than most people could count, yet they still sparked with the fire of someone who refused to accept defeat. The Willow Creek Ranch had been in the Richardson family for 4 generations. What started as 2,000 acres of prime grazing land had slowly dwindled over the years. Economic pressures, medical bills from her late husband's cancer treatment, and the natural challenges of aging had forced Eleanor to sell off parcels piece by piece. Now, in October 2019, she was down to her final 40 acres and one precious Holstein cow named Bessie. Bessie wasn't just any cow. She was the last link to Eleanor's past, the final reminder of what the ranch used to be. Her great-grandfather had brought the first Holstein to this land in 1889, and through careful breeding and unwavering dedication, the Richardson family had built a reputation for having some of the finest dairy cattle in the state. Bessie was descended from that original bloodline, making her not just livestock, but living history. The ranch house itself told the story of a family's journey through time. Built in 1902 by Eleanor's grandfather, the 2-story wooden structure had weathered countless storms, both literal and metaphorical. The wraparound porch where Eleanor spent her evenings was lined with rocking chairs that had hosted 3 generations of Richardsons. Inside, the walls were covered with black and white photographs showing the ranch in its glory days, when hundreds of cattle dotted the pastures and the family employed a dozen ranch hands. Eleanor's daily routine had remained remarkably consistent for decades. She rose before dawn, made her coffee strong and black, and walked the property to check on Bessie and survey her land. Despite her age, she moved with purpose, though her steps had grown shorter and more careful over the years. Her neighbors in the small town of Cedar Falls, 15 miles away, often marveled at her independence. She still drove her 1987 Ford pickup truck, though she limited her trips to town to once a week for groceries and supplies. The financial reality of maintaining even this small portion of the ranch was becoming increasingly difficult. Eleanor's Social Security check barely covered her basic needs, and the cost of feed for Bessie, maintenance for the property, and her own medical expenses created a constant struggle. She had received several offers from developers interested in buying her remaining land, but the thought of selling made her physically ill. This wasn't just property to her. It was her identity, her purpose, her connection to everyone she had ever loved. Her nearest neighbor, Tom Brady, lived 3 miles down the county road. At 58, Tom was considered young by local standards, and he had appointed himself as Eleanor's unofficial guardian. He stopped by twice a week, bringing fresh vegetables from his garden and checking to make sure she was managing okay. Tom understood the depth of Eleanor's attachment to her land because he came from a ranching family himself. His own property had once been much larger before economic pressures forced him to sell portions to survive. During one of his visits in early September, Tom had noticed something troubling. Animal tracks around Eleanor's property suggested an increasing presence of coyotes in the area. Montana had always been home to these adaptable predators, but recent environmental changes had pushed them to become bolder and more desperate. A severe drought the previous year had reduced their natural prey, and construction of new housing developments had displaced them from traditional hunting grounds. Tom tried to convince Eleanor to consider moving Bessie to his property temporarily, where his electric fence system and proximity to his house might provide better protection. Eleanor politely but firmly refused. "Bessie belongs here," she told him, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This is her home, just like it's mine. We don't abandon family when things get tough." The coyote problem in the region had been escalating for months. Local ranchers had lost sheep, chickens, and even young calves to increasingly aggressive packs. The Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department had received numerous reports, but their resources were limited, and the vast rural landscape made effective intervention nearly impossible. They offered advice about securing livestock and recommended that isolated ranchers consider relocating their animals to more protected areas, but they couldn't guarantee any specific protection measures. Eleanor had always been self-reliant, a trait that served her well during her younger years, but was becoming more challenging as she aged. She had no children, having lost her only son, Michael, to a car accident 20 years earlier. Her husband, Robert, had passed away from cancer in 2010, leaving her to manage the ranch alone. The isolation that once felt like freedom was now becoming a source of vulnerability, though Eleanor would never admit it. Her typical evening routine involved sitting on the front porch with her grandfather's 12-gauge shotgun across her lap, watching Bessie graze in the pasture that stretched out in front of the house. The gun had been a constant companion for decades, used primarily to scare off the occasional black bear or mountain lion that wandered onto the property. Eleanor was an excellent shot, having learned from her father when she was just 10 years old. "A ranch woman needs to be able to protect what's hers," he had told her, and that lesson had stayed with her throughout her life. As September turned to October, the signs of increasing coyote activity became impossible to ignore. Eleanor found tracks near the barn almost daily, and twice she heard the distinctive howling that indicated a pack was nearby. The sounds usually came at dusk or dawn, times when coyotes were most active. Bessie seemed to sense the growing danger, staying closer to the barn and appearing more agitated than usual. The weather was turning colder, and Eleanor knew that winter's approach would make the coyotes even more desperate for food. She had survived Montana winters for nearly a century, and she understood the brutal reality of how hunger could drive animals to take extraordinary risks. What she didn't fully comprehend yet was just how extraordinary the risk was about to become. On the evening of October 15th, Eleanor noticed something different about the tracks around her property. There were more of them, and they seemed to form patterns that suggested coordination among multiple animals. Tom stopped by the next morning and confirmed her fears. "Eleanor," he said, his face grave, "these tracks indicate you're dealing with more than just a few coyotes. This looks like a very large pack, possibly several packs working together." Eleanor nodded, absorbing the information with the calm acceptance of someone who had faced countless challenges before. "Well," she said, straightening her shoulders, "I guess we'll see what they're made of." That night, as October wind rattled the windows of her old house and storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Eleanor had no idea that she was about to face the greatest test of her long and remarkable life. The bond between her and Bessie, forged over years of shared solitude and mutual dependence, was about to be tested by forces that would challenge everything she believed about courage, determination, and the lengths to which love could carry the human spirit. She cleaned her shotgun carefully that evening, checking and rechecking the ammunition. Something in the air felt different, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Eleanor May Richardson, 96 years old and weighing barely 110 pounds, was preparing for war. October 18th began like any other day on the Willow Creek Ranch, but Eleanor woke with an unusual sense of unease that she couldn't shake. The morning sky was gray and heavy with clouds that promised the first significant snowfall of the season. As she made her way to the kitchen for her morning coffee, every creak of the old floorboards seemed louder than usual. Every shadow in the corners of her vision seemed to move with purpose. Bessie was standing near the fence closest to the house when Eleanor stepped onto the porch, which was unusual. Normally, the cow would be grazing in the far pasture at this time of morning, enjoying the cooler air before the sun fully rose. Eleanor studied her carefully, noting the way Bessie's ears swiveled constantly, alert to sounds that human ears couldn't detect. The cow's behavior confirmed what Eleanor's instincts were telling her. Something was wrong. The tracks around the property had multiplied overnight. Eleanor walked the perimeter of her fence line, something she did every morning, but today the evidence of coyote presence was overwhelming. The soft earth near the water trough was crisscrossed with paw prints, and she counted at least 20 different sets. More troubling was the way the tracks seemed to circle the property, as if the animals had been surveying their target, studying the layout, and looking for weaknesses. By midday, the first snowflakes began to fall, large and wet, melting as soon as they touched the ground. Eleanor knew from a lifetime of reading Montana weather that this was just the beginning. The temperature would drop throughout the day, and by evening they would be dealing with the kind of snowfall that could accumulate several inches in a matter of hours. This would make the coyotes even more desperate, as winter weather always reduced their hunting opportunities. Eleanor spent the afternoon preparing for what she increasingly believed would be a confrontation. She moved additional ammunition to strategic locations around the house, placing boxes of shells on the front porch, in the kitchen, and upstairs in the bedroom that overlooked the pasture. She checked and double-checked her grandfather's shotgun, cleaning it once more and testing the action to ensure it would function smoothly even in cold weather. More importantly, she prepared Bessie's shelter. The old barn was sturdy, but large, with numerous places where small predators could potentially enter. Eleanor decided to move Bessie to the smaller storage shed that was closer to the house and had only one entrance. She spent hours reinforcing the shed's wooden walls with additional boards and ensuring that the door would latch securely. The shed wasn't ideal, but it would force any attackers to come from a single direction, making them easier to defend against. As evening approached, Eleanor called Tom Brady. She didn't mention her growing certainty that something significant was about to happen, but she wanted someone to know her situation. "Just checking in," she told him. "Weather's turning pretty rough out here." Tom offered to drive over and stay the night, but Eleanor politely declined. "I'm fine," she said. "Just wanted someone to know I'm thinking about the weather." The sun set early behind thick clouds, and by 6 o'clock, the ranch was blanketed in an eerie twilight. Snow was falling steadily now, creating a muffled silence that made every sound seem both distant and amplified. Eleanor brought Bessie into the shed and secured her for the night, giving the cow extra feed and fresh water. Bessie seemed nervous but trusting, nuzzling Eleanor's shoulder as she always did during their evening routine. Eleanor's dinner consisted of leftover soup and a piece of bread, eaten quickly while standing at the kitchen window watching the pasture. She wasn't really hungry, but she knew she needed to maintain her strength. As full darkness settled over the ranch, she turned off all the lights in the house except for a small lamp in the living room. She wanted to be able to see outside without being silhouetted against bright windows. The first sign of trouble came at 8:30. Eleanor was sitting in her rocking chair on the front porch, shotgun across her lap, when she heard Bessie moving restlessly in the shed. The cow was normally quiet at night, content to rest after a day of grazing. The shuffling and occasional low mooing suggested she was agitated about something her superior senses could detect. Eleanor strained her ears, listening for any unusual sounds beyond the whisper of falling snow. For several minutes, she heard nothing but the normal nighttime sounds of a ranch. The wind through the eaves of the barn, the settling of old wood, the distant hoot of an owl. Then, carried on the wind, she heard something that made her blood run cold. It was a howl, but not like any coyote call she had heard before. This was deeper, more organized, almost like a signal. It was answered immediately by another howl from a different direction, then another and another. Within moments, the night air was filled with a chorus of voices that seemed to come from every direction at once. Eleanor had heard coyote packs before, but this was something entirely different. The sounds were coordinated, purposeful, and there were far more of them than she had ever encountered. She stood up slowly, every muscle in her body tensing with anticipation. The howling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, but the silence that followed was even more ominous. It was the kind of silence that comes when predators are moving into position, when the hunt is about to begin in earnest. Eleanor made her way back into the house and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, which had the best view of the entire property. From her window, she could see the shed where Bessie was secured, the barn, and most of the pasture that surrounded the house. She positioned herself in a chair by the window, shotgun ready, and began her vigil. The snow continued to fall, creating a white blanket that would make any movement across the open ground clearly visible. Eleanor understood that this weather could work either for her or against her, depending on how the situation developed. The snow would make it easier to track any intruders, but it would also muffle sounds and create visual distortions that could be used to advantage by creatures that were naturally adapted to winter hunting. At 9:15, she saw the first shadow moving across the pasture. At first, Eleanor thought it might be a trick of the light, the way falling snow could create shapes and movements that weren't really there. But as she watched, the shadow resolved into the unmistakable form of a coyote, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of a predator approaching its target. The animal was larger than most coyotes she had seen, and it moved with a confidence that suggested it was no stranger to confronting humans and their property. The lone coyote stopped about 50 yards from the house and stood perfectly still for several long minutes, studying the shed where Bessie was kept. Eleanor could see its breath, creating small puffs of steam in the cold air. The animal's head moved slowly from side to side, taking in every detail of its surroundings, memorizing the layout for what was clearly a planned attack. Then, the second coyote appeared, emerging from behind the barn with the same careful, deliberate movement. This one was noticeably larger than the first, possibly the pack leader. It approached to within 30 yards of the house before stopping and repeating the same methodical surveillance. Eleanor realized she was watching a reconnaissance mission, not a random encounter. Over the next hour, more coyotes appeared. They emerged from the tree line that bordered her property, from behind outbuildings, and from places Eleanor wouldn't have thought could conceal an animal. Each new arrival added to what was becoming an overwhelming presence surrounding her home. By 10 o'clock, Eleanor could count at least 30 individual animals positioned around her property, and she suspected there were many more that remained hidden from her view. The behavior of these coyotes was unlike anything she had ever witnessed or heard about from other ranchers. They weren't acting on pure instinct or simple hunger. This was coordinated, strategic, almost military in its precision. They had clearly been studying her property for days, or perhaps weeks, learning the routines, identifying the weaknesses, and planning their approach. What made the situation even more extraordinary was that the coyotes seemed to be aware of her presence in the house, but they weren't deterred by it. Normally, the scent and sight of humans would be enough to keep coyotes at a respectful distance. These animals showed no fear, only patience and determination. Eleanor checked her shotgun once more and counted her ammunition. She had 48 shells readily available, with more stored in various locations throughout the house. Against a few coyotes, this would be more than adequate. Against what appeared to be a massive coordinated pack, she began to wonder if it would be enough. As the night wore on, the snow continued to fall, and the temperature dropped steadily. Eleanor could see her breath inside the house now, but she didn't dare start a fire or turn on the heating system. She needed to be able to hear everything that was happening outside, and any mechanical noise might mask the sounds of movement that could give her advance warning of an attack. At 11:30, the waiting game ended. A howl rose from somewhere in the darkness beyond her property, different from the earlier calls. This was clearly a command, a signal to begin whatever action had been planned. Eleanor gripped her shotgun tighter and prepared herself for what she increasingly believed would be the most dangerous night of her very long life. The coyotes began to move. The attack began with such coordination that Eleanor initially questioned whether she was witnessing the behavior of wild animals or something far more calculated and intelligent. At exactly 11:45, the coyotes that had been positioned around her property began moving simultaneously toward the shed where Bessie was secured. They advanced in waves, with the first group moving openly across the pasture while others used the barn and outbuildings as cover. Eleanor's first shot came when a large male coyote reached the door of the shed and began testing the latch with its nose and paws. The blast from her 12-gauge shotgun shattered the winter silence and sent the immediate attackers scrambling for cover, but their retreat was only temporary. Within minutes, they were back, approaching from different angles and showing a level of persistence that chilled Eleanor to her core. From her position at the bedroom window, Eleanor had an excellent view of most of the property, but she quickly realized that the coyotes understood this advantage and were using it against her. While some animals provided visible targets that drew her attention and gunfire, others worked in the blind spots around the house, testing windows, trying doors, and looking for any way to breach her defenses. The sound of Bessie's distressed mooing from the shed broke Eleanor's heart. But she knew that leaving her protected position to comfort the cow would be exactly what the attackers were hoping for. She forced herself to maintain her strategic position and continued defending from a distance, even though every instinct told her to run to Bessie's side. By midnight, Eleanor had fired 8 shots and was certain she had wounded at least 2 coyotes, though the snow made it difficult to confirm kills or track wounded animals. More troubling was the fact that her shooting seemed to have no deterrent effect on the overall attack. If anything, the pack was becoming more aggressive, more coordinated in their approach. The first attempt to breach the house came at 12:20. Eleanor heard scratching sounds from the kitchen below, followed by the distinctive sound of claws on wood. She crept down the stairs, shotgun ready, and found 3 coyotes on the back porch, working together to tear at the screen door. One was holding the door steady, while the other 2 used their claws and teeth to enlarge holes in the screening. Eleanor's shot through the kitchen window scattered the immediate threat, but the damage was done. The screen door was destroyed, and the wooden door behind it showed deep scratches where the animals had been testing its strength. Eleanor realized that what she was facing wasn't just a large pack of hungry predators. This was something approaching siege warfare, conducted by animals with an intelligence that defied everything she thought she knew about coyote behavior. The temperature inside the house was dropping steadily, and Eleanor's breath created clouds of vapor as she moved from window to window, tracking the movements of her attackers. She had turned off the propane heater hours earlier to reduce noise, and now the cold was becoming a factor in her ability to remain alert and accurate with her shooting. At 1 o'clock, the attack intensity increased dramatically. Eleanor counted over 50 coyotes now visible around her property, with many more suggested by the sounds of movement in areas she couldn't see. They were working in coordinated groups. Some continued to test the shed where Bessie was held. Others systematically examined every potential entry point into the house. And still others seemed to be serving as sentries, watching for any change in Eleanor's defensive position. The most disturbing development was that the coyotes had begun using tools. Eleanor watched in amazement as several animals worked together to drag a fallen tree branch to the side of the house, positioning it where it could be used as a ramp to reach a first-floor window. This level of problem-solving and cooperation went beyond anything documented in wildlife behavior studies. Eleanor's ammunition was becoming a serious concern. She had fired 23 rounds and had only 25 shells remaining in easily accessible locations. The other ammunition was stored in the basement, which would require her to leave her defensive position and expose herself to attack. She began to consider the possibility that she might not have enough firepower to outlast this siege. The psychological pressure of the sustained attack was taking its toll. Eleanor had faced many dangers in her long life, but she had never experienced anything like the relentless, intelligent pressure these animals were applying. Every time she focused on one area of threat, attacks would intensify in other locations. When she moved to defend a window on one side of the house, coyotes would immediately test the defenses on the opposite side. At 2 a.m, the situation reached a critical point. A group of coyotes had managed to tear a significant hole in the roof of the shed where Bessie was sheltered. Eleanor could hear the cows' panicked bellowing and knew that Bessie was in immediate danger. At the same time, another group had succeeded in breaking through the screen on a downstairs window and was working on the glass behind it. Eleanor faced an impossible choice: defend the house or save Bessie. Every rational consideration told her to maintain her position and protect herself, but the bond between her and the cow went beyond rational calculation. Bessie represented everything Eleanor had left of her family's legacy, her connection to the land, and her purpose in life. She made her decision with the kind of instant clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. Eleanor grabbed her shotgun, stuffed her pockets with shells, and headed for the back door of the house. She was going to fight her way to the shed and make her stand there with Bessie regardless of the odds. The moment Eleanor opened the back door, she was hit by a wave of cold air and the overwhelming scent of wild animals. The snow was now falling heavily, reducing visibility to just a few yards, but she could hear movement all around her. The distance from the house to the shed was only about 40 feet, but those 40 feet looked like a gauntlet that would test every survival skill she had learned in her 96 years. Eleanor's first step off the back porch triggered an immediate response from the watching coyotes. They seemed to understand that their quarry was finally vulnerable, finally exposed, and they moved to take advantage. Eleanor saw shapes moving in her peripheral vision, heard the sound of paws running across snow-covered ground, and prepared herself for the most dangerous walk of her life. Her shotgun boomed twice in quick succession as coyotes charged for both sides. The animals were faster than she had anticipated, more aggressive than any wild creature she had ever encountered. One grazed her shoulder as it leaped past, knocked off balance by her gunshot, but not stopped. Eleanor kept moving toward the shed, firing at any target that presented itself, knowing that if she stopped or hesitated, she would be overwhelmed. The door to the shed was still intact, but showed deep scratches and bite marks where the coyotes had been working to break through. Eleanor fumbled with the latch while keeping her shotgun ready, aware that every second of delay increased her vulnerability. Behind her, she could hear the animals regrouping, preparing for another coordinated assault. When the shed door finally opened, Eleanor was greeted by the sight of Bessie, standing in the corner, eyes wide with terror, but unharmed. The hole in the roof was larger than it had appeared from the house, and snow was accumulating inside the shed, but the cow was safe for the moment. Eleanor slammed the door behind her, and threw the heavy wooden bar across it, creating a barrier that would require significant effort to breach. The shed was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with rough wooden walls and a dirt floor. It contained some basic farm equipment and feed storage, but no real comfort for a prolonged siege. Eleanor positioned herself where she could watch both the door and the hole in the roof, with Bessie behind her in the corner that offered the most protection. For a few minutes, there was relative quiet outside. Eleanor used this time to count her remaining ammunition, 17 shells in her pockets, plus what was already loaded in the gun. Not nearly enough if the siege continued much longer, but enough to make any assault on the shed very costly for the attackers. Then the real battle began. The coyotes had apparently decided that with Eleanor and Bessie trapped in the shed, they could afford to launch an all-out assault. The noise outside became overwhelming. Scratching, howling, the sound of multiple animals throwing themselves against the walls and door. Eleanor realized that what she had experienced so far had been merely probing attacks, testing her defenses, and wearing down her resources. Now, the coyotes were committed to finishing what they had started. The first real breach came when a coyote managed to enlarge the hole in the roof enough to squeeze through. Eleanor's shot caught the animal before it could drop to the floor, but its body fell into the shed, and the hole was now large enough for multiple animals to enter simultaneously. Eleanor knew that she had perhaps minutes before the defenses failed completely, and she would be fighting at close quarters in a space too small for effective maneuvering. Outside, the sounds of the assault intensified. Eleanor estimated that she was now facing over 100 coyotes, all focused on the single objective of breaking into the shed. The wooden walls shook under repeated impacts, and she could see claws and teeth working at every joint and gap in the construction. Eleanor May Richardson, 96 years old and down to her last 16 shotgun shells, prepared to make her final stand. She positioned herself to cover both the door and the roof breach, with one hand resting protectively on Bessie's flank. If this was how her story would end, she was determined to write a conclusion that would honor 4 generations of Richardsons who had refused to surrender what was theirs. The battle for Willow Creek Ranch was about to reach its climax. What happened in the next 3 hours would defy every expectation about what a 96-year-old woman could endure and what wild animals would attempt when driven by desperation and unusual organization. Eleanor found herself fighting not just for her life and Bessie's safety, but for something larger, the principle that determination and courage could overcome impossible odds, even when logic suggested surrender was the only sensible option. The assault on the shed intensified beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined. Coyotes were now dropping through the enlarged hole in the roof at a rate that tested her ability to reload and fire fast enough to keep them at bay. Her grandfather's shotgun, reliable as it had been for decades, was beginning to show the strain of rapid, continuous firing. The barrel was getting hot despite the freezing air, and the action was becoming stiff from the combination of cold and overuse. Eleanor's shooting had to be precise and economical. She couldn't afford to waste ammunition on warning shots or near misses. Every shell had to count, every trigger pull had to eliminate a threat. The confined space of a shed made accuracy easier, but also increased the danger from wounded animals that were trapped inside with her and Bessie. By 3 in the morning, Eleanor had killed or seriously wounded over 30 coyotes, but her ammunition was nearly exhausted. She was down to 4 shells, and the attacks showed no sign of diminishing. If anything, the coyotes seemed to be entering some kind of frenzy, throwing themselves at the defenses with a disregard for their own safety that suggested they were being driven by something beyond normal predator behavior. The physical demands of the battle were taking their toll. Eleanor's shoulders ached from the repeated recoil of the shotgun. Her hands were cramping from gripping the weapon in freezing temperatures, and her legs were beginning to shake from the strain of standing ready to fire for hours. At 96, her body simply wasn't designed for this kind of sustained combat, but her will remained unbroken. Bessie had been remarkably calm throughout the ordeal, perhaps sensing that panic would only make their situation worse. The cow stayed pressed against the back wall of the shed, occasionally making soft sounds of distress, but never becoming agitated enough to interfere with Eleanor's defensive efforts. It was as if the animal understood that her survival depended entirely on the old woman with the gun. At 3:30, the wooden bar across the door finally gave way under repeated impacts. The door swung open, and Eleanor found herself facing a rush of coyotes that filled the doorway like a gray-brown wave. Her last 4 shells stopped the initial charge, but now she was out of ammunition and facing what appeared to be dozens of additional attackers waiting outside. This was the moment when Eleanor Richardson discovered reserves of strength and determination that she didn't know she possessed. With no ammunition left, she turned her shotgun into a club, swinging it with surprising force at any coyote that came within range. The heavy wooden stock connected with skulls and ribs, and the long barrel allowed her to keep most attackers at a distance while staying between them and Bessie. The coyotes seemed surprised by this new form of resistance. They had clearly expected their prey to collapse once the ammunition was exhausted, but instead they found themselves facing an elderly woman who fought with the fury of someone protecting everything she held dear. Eleanor's fierce resistance bought her precious time and forced the attackers to reassess their strategy. But time was running out. Eleanor's physical strength was limited, and the coyotes were regrouping for what would certainly be an overwhelming final assault. It was at this moment, when defeat seemed inevitable, that the tide of battle began to shift in an unexpected way. The change started with a disturbance among the coyotes outside the shed. Eleanor heard sounds of confusion and conflict, howls of pain, and anger that didn't seem to be directed at her. Through the broken doorway, she caught glimpses of movement that suggested the coyotes were fighting among themselves rather than focusing on their attack. What Eleanor was witnessing was the breakdown of the pack structure that had made the coordinated assault possible. The enormous gathering of coyotes had been held together by a combination of desperation and strong leadership, but the massive casualties inflicted by Eleanor's defense had eliminated many of the pack leaders and disrupted the chain of command that kept the group functioning as a unit. Coyotes from different packs, brought together by unusual circumstances, were now reverting to their natural territorial instincts. Competition for the anticipated prize turned into actual combat as different groups turned on each other. The unified assault dissolved into a chaotic free-for-all that drew the attackers' attention away from Eleanor and Bessie. Eleanor recognized the opportunity and pressed her advantage. She continued to defend the shed entrance with her improvised club, but now she was facing individual attackers rather than coordinated waves of assault. Single coyotes were manageable, even for a 96-year-old woman armed with determination and a heavy shotgun stock. The fighting outside intensified as more coyote packs turned on each other. The noise was tremendous. Howling, snarling, the sounds of animals engaged in vicious combat. Eleanor realized that what had been her greatest threat was now working in her favor. The very size of the force arrayed against her had become its weakness, as natural coyote behavior reasserted itself over the unusual cooperation that had made the initial attack so dangerous. As dawn approached, bringing the first faint light to the eastern horizon, the situation continued to evolve in Eleanor's favor. Many of the coyotes had fled the area entirely. Unwilling to continue fighting as daylight made them more vulnerable, and their natural caution reasserted itself. Others were occupied with internal conflicts that had nothing to do with the original objective of attacking Eleanor's livestock. By 5 in the morning, when the winter sun finally rose above the snow-covered landscape of the Willow Creek Ranch, Eleanor found herself and Bessie alone in the damaged shed, surrounded by evidence of one of the most extraordinary wildlife encounters in Montana history. The immediate area around the shed was littered with coyote carcasses, and the snow was stained with blood and churned into a muddy mixture by the prolonged battle. Eleanor's first priority was to check Bessie for injuries. Miraculously, the cow had escaped the entire ordeal without a scratch. She was traumatized and exhausted, but physically unharmed. Eleanor herself had suffered only minor injuries, scratches from flying debris, bruises from the shotgun's recoil, and the general battering that comes from hours of intense physical activity. At 96, she had survived a night that would have challenged men a third of her age. The shed itself had been transformed into a battlefield monument. The walls were scarred with claw marks, the roof had multiple holes, and the door hung broken from its hinges. But it had served its purpose, providing just enough protection to allow Eleanor to make her heroic stand. As Eleanor surveyed the aftermath of the battle, she began to understand the true scope of what she had faced. The number of coyote tracks in the snow around her property suggested that she had been confronted by not just one large pack, but multiple packs that had somehow been drawn together by circumstances she might never fully understand. Wildlife biologists would later estimate that she had faced between 800 and 1,200 individual coyotes over the course of the night, making her stand one of the most remarkable human-wildlife encounters ever documented. Eleanor made her way back to the house as the sun climbed higher, with Bessie following close behind. The house had suffered some damage from the attempted break-ins, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. More importantly, it remained fundamentally intact, just like Eleanor herself. She put on a pot of coffee and sat down at her kitchen table to process what had happened. Her hands were steady as she raised the cup to her lips, showing no sign of the trauma she had just endured. Eleanor May Richardson had faced the impossible and emerged victorious, proving that courage, determination, and love could triumph over overwhelming odds. But the story wasn't over yet. Word of Eleanor's battle would soon spread beyond the boundaries of her remote ranch, and the consequences of that extraordinary night would extend far beyond what she could have imagined. The 96-year-old woman who had fought off 1,000 coyotes was about to become something she had never sought to be, a legend. The first person to arrive at Willow Creek Ranch was Tom Brady, who had become increasingly worried when Eleanor didn't answer her phone that morning. He had tried calling 3 times before deciding to drive over and check on her personally. What he found when he arrived at 8:30 that morning was a scene that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Tom's pickup truck crunched through fresh snow as he drove up Eleanor's long driveway, but he began to slow down when he saw the tracks. The snow around Eleanor's property was churned into a chaotic pattern of paw prints, drag marks, and disturbed earth that told the story of a massive disturbance. Blood stained the white snow in multiple locations, and Tom counted at least 40 coyote carcasses scattered around the property. When he reached the house, Tom found Eleanor sitting on her front porch in a rocking chair, shotgun across her lap, calmly drinking coffee and watching Bessie graze in the pasture as if nothing unusual had happened. The only signs of the night's ordeal were the scratches on her hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the battle-scarred shed that stood as testament to her incredible stand. "Morning, Tom," Eleanor said as he approached, her voice carrying its usual steady calm. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Tom stared at the destruction around the property, then at the elderly woman who seemed utterly unaffected by what had clearly been an extraordinary event. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "what in God's name happened here?" Eleanor took another sip of her coffee and looked out at Bessie, who was peacefully eating hay as if the previous night had been just another quiet evening on the ranch. "Had some visitors last night," she said. "They didn't stay long." It took Tom nearly an hour to extract the full story from Eleanor, who seemed to regard her single-handed battle against a massive coyote pack as simply another challenge that ranch life had presented. Her matter-of-fact recounting of the events made them seem almost routine, but the physical evidence around the property told a different story entirely. Tom immediately called the sheriff's office, partly to report the incident, but mainly because he knew that what Eleanor had accomplished needed to be documented. Sheriff Mike Watson arrived within 2 hours, accompanied by a wildlife biologist from the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Park Department. Both men were initially skeptical of Tom's phone report, but the evidence at the scene quickly convinced them that they were dealing with something unprecedented. Dr. Sarah Chun, the wildlife biologist, spent 3 days documenting the aftermath of Eleanor's battle. She counted 127 coyote carcasses in the immediate vicinity of the ranch, with evidence suggesting that many more had been wounded or killed, but carried away by surviving pack members. The tracks in the snow told a story of coordination and tactical thinking that challenged everything the scientific community thought it knew about coyote behavior. What happened here defies normal wildlife behavior patterns, Dr. Chen wrote in her preliminary report. The level of organization, persistence, and tactical coordination displayed by these animals suggests either an unprecedented adaptation to environmental pressures or the emergence of new behavioral patterns that we don't yet understand. News of Eleanor's battle spread through the local community within days, but the story really took off when a reporter from the Billings Gazette picked up the story and ran it as a human interest piece. The article, titled 96-Year-Old Ranchwoman Fights Off Coyote Army, was picked up by wire services and began appearing in newspapers across the country. Within a week, Eleanor found herself at the center of a media storm that was completely foreign to her quiet rural lifestyle. Television news crews made the journey to Willow Creek Ranch. Radio hosts called for interviews, and her mailbox began filling with letters from people around the world who had been inspired by her story. Eleanor handled the attention with the same calm pragmatism she had applied to the coyote attack. She gave a few interviews, mainly because Tom convinced her that her story might help other rural residents prepare for similar encounters, but she was generally more interested in repairing her shed and getting back to her normal routine. The scientific community was fascinated by the behavioral implications of the incident. Dr. Chen's detailed report sparked debates among wildlife biologists about the adaptability of coyote populations and the potential for predator species to develop new strategies in response to environmental pressures. Several research teams requested permission to study Eleanor's property and the surrounding area to better understand what had triggered such unusual animal behavior. More practically, Eleanor's battle led to changes in wildlife management policies throughout Montana and other western states. Local authorities began taking reports of unusual coyote activity more seriously, and new protocols were developed for assisting isolated rural residents who might be facing similar threats. Eleanor herself seemed largely unaffected by her newfound fame. She repaired the shed, reinforced her property's defenses, and continued her daily routine of caring for Bessie and maintaining the ranch. When asked by reporters how she felt about becoming a celebrity, she typically responded with something like, "I just did what needed doing. Nothing special about that." But the letters she received told a different story. People wrote to her from around the world, sharing their own stories of perseverance and drawing inspiration from her example. Elderly people found new motivation to face their own challenges. Rural families felt less isolated in their struggles, and countless individuals discovered that courage could exist in the most unexpected forms. The economic impact of Eleanor's story was immediate and significant. The attention brought by the media coverage led to several book deal offers, speaking engagement requests, and even a movie proposal. Eleanor turned down most of these opportunities, but she did accept help from a local contractor who volunteered to repair and upgrade her property's defenses at no charge. More importantly, Eleanor's story attracted the attention of several agricultural preservation organizations that offered assistance in maintaining her ranch as a working operation. With their help, she was able to establish a small trust that would ensure Bessie's care and the property's maintenance regardless of what happened to Eleanor in the future. The legal implications of the incident were complex and unprecedented. While Eleanor had clearly acted in self-defense, the scale of the coyote casualties raised questions about wildlife protection laws and the rights of property owners to defend their livestock. The case eventually led to new legislation clarifying the legal framework for such situations, ensuring that other rural residents would have clear legal standing to defend their property and animals. As months passed, and the media attention gradually faded, Eleanor returned to her preferred state of quiet anonymity. But the impact of her story continued to ripple outward in ways both large and small. Children in local schools studied her example in lessons about courage and perseverance. The Montana Historical Society added her story to their archives as an example of the enduring frontier spirit. Wildlife management protocols were permanently changed based on what scientists learned from studying the incident. Eleanor's daily routine remained largely unchanged. She still rose before dawn, made her coffee, and checked on Bessie. She still sat on her front porch in the evenings, watching her cow graze in the pasture. The shotgun still lay across her lap, though she had upgraded to a newer model with greater capacity and reliability. But there were changes too. The shed had been rebuilt as a fortress that could withstand any future assault. Motion sensors and security lights now protected the property's perimeter. Most importantly, Eleanor was no longer alone in her isolation. The story of her battle had created a network of supporters who checked on her regularly and ensured that she had everything she needed to maintain her independence. On quiet evenings, when a Montana sky stretched endlessly overhead and Bessie grazed peacefully in the pasture, Eleanor sometimes reflected on that October night when everything had changed. She didn't consider herself a hero or a legend. In her mind, she had simply done what any responsible person would do when faced with a threat to something they loved. But the world saw something different in Eleanor May Richardson. They saw proof that courage has no expiration date, that determination can overcome impossible odds, and that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes are found in the most ordinary places. They saw a 96-year-old woman who refused to surrender, who stood her ground against overwhelming force, and who proved that the human spirit can triumph over any challenge when fueled by love and unwavering purpose. Eleanor continued to live on the Willow Creek Ranch for several more years, becoming a symbol of resilience and determination for people around the world. When she finally passed away at the age of 101, peacefully in her sleep, she left behind a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of her small Montana ranch. The Willow Creek Ranch was preserved as a historical site, with the rebuilt shed serving as a monument to Eleanor's extraordinary stand. Bessie lived out her days in comfort, cared for by the trust Eleanor had established. And the story of a night when a 96-year-old woman fought off 1,000 coyotes became part of American folklore, inspiring generations of people to find courage in the face of impossible odds. Eleanor May Richardson had proven that heroes come in all ages and sizes, that love can make anyone unbeatable, and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not for glory or recognition, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Her legacy reminded the world that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they refuse to give up on what matters most to them.